I found a video of my wife cheating on me with 3 men in different places, and I showed it in court and sued for a couple of million. I was looking around the restaurant for my client when I looked straight ahead and saw my ex-wife, Jessica. She was snuggled up against a middle-aged man who appeared to have been in good form previously, but had obviously let himself go over the years. He was somewhat overweight. Jessica was sitting next to him, looking perfectly happy, and there was no denying that this man was wealthy. We used to be together, and as I stood there in the foyer, memories of that time flooded back. Our divorce was 5 years ago, yet the feelings were as raw and devastating as if it had all happened yesterday. Rather than being by her side, I discovered that I was only an observer in her new world, where her needs were satisfied and my problems were far from over. A business trip to Boston for a client meeting marked the beginning of it all. I had intended to spend the night in order to avoid the tiresome drive back. But the client contacted to cancel an hour into the drive due to a car accident. He apologized extensively for any trouble caused, even though he was all right. I told him it wouldn't be a huge deal and proposed a new time. Though I seemed composed on the outside, I was dreading the 3-hour drive back due to the last-minute change in plans. I made the decision to surprise my wife with a romantic supper, determined to make the most of it. When I eventually turned onto my street 2 hours later, I was excited for the evening. Instead, I found myself greeted by 4 strange cars parked in my driveway. I dismissed it, figuring Jessica would probably bring people over while I was out, and parked on the street. When I first walked into the house, I thought everything would be how it was. But when I saw the garments all over the living room floor, I became really alarmed. I understood that the sounds I was hearing were not harmless as I stood there, and a horrible feeling came over me. My wife's groans were clearly ones of pleasure rather than anguish. The terrible realization that Jessica was cheating on me struck me, and my heart fell. I didn't want to, but I knew I had to face whatever was going on upstairs. Her screams were primal, and I could hear them as I reached the top of the steps. I turned my stomach when I peered over the bedroom doorframe and saw what was there. She was accompanied by her boss, Michael Smith, and 2 strangers. They were involving my wife in things that made my blood boil. As Michael showered her with compliments and took advantage of her for his own gain, my loathing for him grew. They used foul language, treated her like an object, and demonstrated their power over her. As I watched, I experienced a mixture of disdain and rage, as I couldn't make sense of this lady and the Jessica I had known for 12 years. I quietly withdrew, tiptoed downstairs, and took cover in my office. I reached for my digital video camera, which was thankfully still partially charged, and found an old Christmas cassette inside. My goal was to document this betrayal, not to endure any torturous minutes before my feelings overcame me. A moment like that would arouse some people, but all it did for me was make me feel depressed and deeply betrayed. Disappointed beyond belief, I headed back downstairs to gather my thoughts. I went to my office and got my gun out of the safe, turning it off just in case. I wasn't violent by nature, but there was an overwhelming need to be in charge. I went back to the living room and grabbed the wallets and car keys from the jeans that were lying on the ground. After that, I walked outside and deflated every car's tire, including Jessica's. A sly smile appeared on my face as I devised a strategy that I was positive would work. During my filming, I noticed Jessica's mobile phone on the bedside table, so I snuck up behind the stairs and called her. It took her a few rings before she responded. House suggested. She had instructed the others to stay silent, breathless and flustered. She attempted to compose herself, while the faint chuckles of the men echoed in the background. I feigned concern, knowing full well what was to come. As anticipated, 4 disheveled individuals hurriedly descended the stairs into the living room. The men dressed hastily, while Jessica threw on clothes in a panic. She slipped on her shoes and jacket, glancing outside nervously, hoping the coast was clear. If she hadn't been so frantic, she might have noticed my car discreetly parked on the street. I stealthily entered the house through a hidden door. The men started shouting at Jessica, causing her to step onto the porch to hear them better. At that precise moment, I slammed the front door shut and locked it behind her. Jessica saw me through the window trying to plead, but there was no room for discussion. The men returned to the porch, banging on the door and demanding their belongings. Recognizing the escalating tension, I called 911, reporting an attempted break-in. The dispatcher informed me that a neighbor had already called, providing my name and address. The police arrived swiftly within 2 minutes. After questioning Jessica, I approached the officers and claimed that my wife had been mistreated by the men, insisting on their arrest. The men vehemently protested, asserting they were invited and that everything was consensual. Everyone, including myself, turned to Jessica, awaiting her response. Avoiding eye contact, she shamefully admitted that she had indeed invited the men and participated willingly. The men sighed in relief, knowing they would avoid charges. More police cars arrived, and they took down everyone's information. The senior officer explained that since my wife had invited these men and they were all consenting adults, there was little legal recourse. He suggested counseling, his disdain for Jessica evident. I requested the police call a taxi for her, making it clear she was not welcome in the house that night. One of the men called a taxi after discovering their flattened tires. They also accused me of stealing their belongings, which I denied. I turned back to the porch where Jessica waited for the taxi. My eyes burned with anger as I stood there. Despite my rage, Jessica approached me, oblivious to the fury within me and the gun I had on me. Her presence on the porch only intensified my anger. The betrayal was unbearable. She moved towards me, unaware of the storm raging inside me. My heart seethed with fury as I considered the situation. The men attempted to comfort her, but she pushed them away, which gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction that quickly vanished, leaving behind nothing but a deep sense of betrayal. Back in my bedroom, the lingering scent of lemon only fueled my rage. I tore through the room in a destructive frenzy, throwing the mattress out onto the lawn. I grabbed my toolbox from the garage and dismantled the bed, tossing its pieces outside as well. Returning to the bedroom, I picked up Jessica's phone, scrolling through her contacts and messages. As I expected, I found repulsive emails, photos, and videos of her with various men. It was clear she was deeply involved with them. Bitterly laughing at my past ignorance, I acknowledged that those days of naivety were gone forever. I gathered all her belongings from the bedroom and threw them onto the front lawn. Moving to the guest room, I discovered more of her possessions. While emptying the last drawer, I felt something wedged inside. With frustration, I yanked it open, revealing several DVDs hidden underneath. One of the cases was cracked, but the disc remained intact. My heart sank further as I examined the DVDs, thinking the situation couldn't worsen, but it did. Downstairs, I organized everything on a shelf and began watching. The first DVD displayed Jessica and her friend Rachel at Rachel's house, engaging in intimate acts with various people. I watched for hours, tears streaming down my face, stopping only at the final 2 discs. The penultimate disc featured Jessica with her tennis instructor, a service I had generously funded. Her constant exhaustion after lessons now made grim sense. The last DVD was the most devastating Jessica in her office with Michael and his boss John Davis, a man highly respected in the community. This betrayal stung on an entirely new level. I carefully placed her phone, the DVDs, and the tape I had recorded earlier into a large envelope, intending to hand everything over to my lawyer and my best friend Paul, one of the few people I could trust. At that moment, nothing else mattered. I powered up Jessica's computer and copied every file, email, photo, and video onto external drives. It took an hour, but my determination was unyielding. Afterwards, I delved into her digital archives, uncovering videos similar to those on the DVDs and explicit photos. Digging deeper, I unearthed emails from the past 6 months hidden under deceptive file names, exposing even more of her betrayals. I stumbled upon a series of emails between Jessica, Michael, and several other men, including exchanges with Rachel. I had dismissed them last week, but one particular email shattered me. For a brief moment, the thought of using my weapon crossed my mind, but I quickly realized she wasn't worth it. I needed to remain strong. The email that crushed me was from Jessica to Rachel. Rachel had inquired why she hadn't left me and asked her to describe her ideal future husband. Jessica's response was brutally candid and deeply hurtful. In the email, Jessica revealed her disdain for me. She described me as loyal but naive, worrying that I was getting close to uncovering her secret life. She found my increasing weight repulsive and loathed my beard and mustache, which she once adored. She confessed to relishing the thrill of her affairs and mentioned Paul as a potential obstacle if he got involved. Jessica also alluded to promotions and perks from Michael and James, finding their suggestive hints amusing. She expressed her desire for a luxurious lifestyle, including a house and a car, and anticipated securing substantial alimony. She eagerly anticipated their Tuesday escapades and reminisced about a recent encounter with multiple men. Jessica described her ideal partner as wealthy, submissive, and easily manipulated, catering to her every desire without question. She laughed about seeking satisfaction elsewhere as long as she had financial security. The letter concluded abruptly, noting that she had to go because I had just arrived home. Reading this email repeatedly, each word more vile than the last, I realized the depth of her contempt for me and her prolonged infidelity. The extent of her deceit and my blindness to it was soul-crushing. Overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotional turmoil, I finally collapsed on the sofa and eventually succumbed to sleep. Morning plagued by a restless night, I called in sick to work. I reached out to my close friend and lawyer, Paul Rogers. His secretary, Nancy, answered I'd known her almost as long as I'd known Paul. I urgently requested a meeting, but she informed me he'd be in court all day. Nancy relayed my message, and Paul told her to schedule me in an hour, mentioning Rachel Green was a tactic to ensure Paul S. immediate attention. As I got dressed, my phone rang. Reluctant to speak with Jessica, I checked the caller ID. It was an unknown number, so I answered, suspecting it might be Paul. Instead, it was John Davis from Jessica S. office, wanting to discuss the previous night S events. He was likely concerned about retaining Michael Smith's key clients and avoiding negative publicity for his company and himself. I told him I'd call back before noon to arrange a meeting, making it sound like he was negotiating with me, but I had other plans. Stepping outside, I saw the broken bed and Jessica S. clothes scattered across the lawn, creating a scene that looked like a bizarre yard sale. An elderly neighbor waved, clearly curious. I knew I'd become the talk of the neighborhood. In the city center, I grabbed a bite to eat before heading to Paul S. office. Upon arrival, Nancy made me a cup of coffee, reflecting our long history together. She commented on the urgency of my meeting with Paul, hinting at the significance of mentioning Rachel Green. Paul arrived shortly after, having rescheduled his court meeting, and ushered me into his office for privacy. I recounted the events of the previous night and shared what I had discovered about Jessica S. double life, handing him an envelope with the evidence. Paul listened attentively, processing everything, including John Davis' request for a meeting. He recognized the gravity of the situation and the potential legal consequences. We prioritized the actions going after Michael and the tennis club, addressing Jessica S. workplace, and considering legal action against Michael Smith, John Davis, and their associates. Paul noted that as Jessica S. superiors, they had influenced her actions, which could lead to serious legal consequences. He warned me to be prepared for a challenging legal battle. The plan was to leverage the video evidence of Smith, Davis, and Jessica in their boardroom. Paul anticipated that once John Davis realized the extent of our evidence, he would likely push for a settlement. I insisted on a substantial settlement, not less than $3 million, but Paul suggested aiming for $5 million, knowing my legal bills could be high. This marked the beginning of my determined effort to make them all accountable for their actions. Paul suggested I come over tonight at 7:30 p.m. for a dinner that Megan would prepare. Tinking it might help me unwind. He also informed me that he had scheduled an appointment with John Davis for 3 p.m. Just as we were talking, Nancy entered the office to let Paul know that Jessica was on the line. Nancy mentioned that Jessica urgently wanted to speak with him, thinking it might be important. With a sigh, Paul decided to take the call, checking first if she knew I was there. Nancy assured him she didn't think so. As Nancy exited, I commented that Jessica had probably realized her phone, computer, and DVDs were missing, and had seen her belongings strewn across the lawn. Paul acknowledged that I had been through quite an ordeal and asked me to stay quiet while he handled the call. I could hear Paul S.'s side of the conversation, picturing Jessica S.'s desperate responses. He chastised her for betraying me, a good man and his friend, and affirmed that he was representing me with solid arguments. He advised her to secure a competent lawyer because she would need one. He informed Jessica about the 2 p.m. meeting with John Davis but recommended she not attend. He cautioned her against trying to spy on the meeting, as it would only escalate matters. He explained that, just as she had the right to bring strangers into her bedroom, I had the right to remove her possessions from the house. He pointed out that I was armed the previous night for self-defense, believing she was in danger, which was noted in the police report. Paul admitted that if it were his wife, Megan, in such a situation, he might have ended up in jail. He acknowledged that I acted out of anger over her missing items and suggested she stay with Rachel for the time being. He promised to stay in touch and told her to have her lawyer contact him once one was hired. Paul's tone was firm and unyielding, indicating that her tears wouldn't sway him and that he could be ruthless when necessary. He regretted that she would now see a side of him reserved for his adversaries and warned she wouldn't like it. He instructed Jessica to keep her distance from me and remain at her office, as he wanted no further interaction with her. Turning to me, Paul inquired if I had overheard most of the conversation. I confirmed that I had. I expressed my desire to confront her directly, but admitted I wasn't ready to see her yet. Paul then made a couple of requests. He asked for the tapes. I handed over the videotapes from the envelope, including those from last night, the footage of Michael at the tennis club, and the recordings of Jessica with Smith and Davis. Paul suggested I invite Nancy to lunch, noting my puzzled look. He explained that he would review the tapes to spare me further distress before our meeting with Davis. He emphasized that watching them wouldn't benefit me at the moment, and that I needed to remain calm. Recognizing his advice as sound, I thanked him and shared the lunch invitation with Nancy. She joked about choosing an upscale restaurant if Paul was footing the bill. We laughed and left the office. Nancy turned out to be a delightful lunch companion, providing a much-needed distraction from my troubles. When we returned, we found Paul in a good mood, deeply immersed in reviewing the tapes. Paul couldn't contain his excitement over the recordings, doing a small victory dance. He declared the recordings a significant breakthrough, but seeing my expression, he quickly apologized, realizing the pain they caused me. He called me over to his desk to review the footage. I admitted that I had only skimmed through some of it, as watching Jessica with Michael at the tennis club was infuriating. Paul then revealed a shocking detail after Michael and Jessica finished. A crowd gathered in the men's locker room, and Jessica allowed other men to join in. He pointed out an older man with long gray hair and a walrus-like mustache whom Paul recognized. As I watched the man engage with Jessica and others lining up, I struggled to remain composed. Paul emphasized the importance of this footage for our upcoming meeting at the tennis club. His strategic enthusiasm reassured me, reinforcing my trust in him as both a friend and an exceptional lawyer. We left his office and headed downtown with a portable DVD player, printed photos, and legal documents. Arriving at the building, we went to John Davis' office on the top floor just above Jessica S. In the reception area, I sensed someone watching me. A quick glance revealed a woman disappearing around a corner, likely Jessica, which relieved me from confronting her today. Inside John's lavish office, adorned with opulent furniture, plaques, awards, and photos with notable figures, my disdain for him grew. I introduced Paul as my lawyer who would be joining the meeting. John Davis was taken aback, having expected a private meeting. I made it clear that anything he needed to discuss with me could be said in front of Paul. Reluctantly, John accepted Paul's presence and continued, pointedly ignoring him, which amused Paul. John attempted to address me informally, and I suggested involving Michael Smith, as the matter concerned him too. After a brief hesitation, John instructed his assistant Julie to summon Michael immediately. While we waited, John began expressing regret for the disruption Michael and Jessica had caused in my life. He acknowledged the previous night's events as distressing, but hinted at finding a mutually beneficial resolution. I remained skeptical, questioning his sincerity. John conveyed his genuine care for Jessica, but our conversation was interrupted by Michael's arrival. Michael entered the office, clearly surprised to see both Paul and me. His presence only intensified the tension in the room. John introduced Michael and reiterated the need to discuss the events that had unfolded. As John tried to steer the conversation towards a resolution, Paul remained focused, ready to present the damning evidence we had brought. Michael hesitated at the entrance, looking like he might leave, but John firmly told him to sit down. Reluctantly, Michael obeyed, avoiding my gaze. He started by expressing his care for Jessica, but Paul interrupted, questioning if he had a penchant for incest, catching John off guard. I chuckled, understanding Paul's point. John responded, clearly offended, demanding to know what he was being accused of. Paul then placed a DVD player on John's desk, explaining that a picture is worth 1,000 words. He handed Michael screenshots from the video, which he reluctantly passed to John. The images clearly showed John and Michael with my wife, leaving no doubt about their actions. John probably recognized his own boardroom table where the events took place. He asked, nearly speechless, if I had recorded this and shared it. Michael was too stunned to respond. Paul took charge, outlining how things were going to proceed. Firstly, Jessica would keep her job, as I believed she would need it, and she fit in well there. Secondly, Michael was out, while Jessica stayed. Lastly, John was to give us a financial offer that respected our intelligence. We would consider the proposal and respond within 5 business days, with potential legal action within 2 months, if necessary. Before they could react, Paul started the video, showing John and Michael repeatedly engaging in sexual acts with my wife in their boardroom. John watched in shock while Michael looked away, already knowing the content. John seemed to contemplate how to protect his business, family, and finances. He told Michael they needed to discuss his future at the company. He mused aloud about consulting his legal counsel to negotiate a settlement. Paul reassured John that we would keep the matter confidential until we received a serious proposal. However, he advised not to rush to fire Michael just yet, as he might have additional copies of the video which could give him leverage. Paul reminded them that engaging in relations with an employee could have legal consequences affecting their employment status and prospects. As we stood to leave, Paul collected the DVD player and photographs. We exited, leaving John and Michael poised for a private discussion. I noticed Jessica lurking around the corner trying to eavesdrop, but Paul had seen her too. The last thing I heard was John barking into the intercom to get Michael there immediately. I grinned, anticipating an intriguing encounter, as John would soon discover I had found his DVD at home. Once outside, I asked Paul why he had suggested that Michael might use his own videotape against John. Paul explained that dividing and conquering would prevent them from presenting a united front, making it easier to play them against each other if John gave us a lowball offer. He also noted that both Michael and John had families and attended church, despite their behavior in the videotape, and were not eager to disrupt their familial lives. As we left the building, I realized it would now be remembered as the place where my wife betrayed me rather than her esteemed workplace. Paul's words snapped me back to reality, back to, "Grab a beer before our meeting at the tennis club at 5 p.m. We could both use a drink, and there's something important I need to discuss with you." As we drove across town, we stopped at a cozy bar restaurant near the tennis club. Paul ordered 2 beers and began to speak. He shared his belief that John Davis would likely make an offer just under $1 million. Knowing John's legal team from a previous case, Paul anticipated a shrewd negotiation. He planned to call John the next day, making it clear that a lowball offer wouldn't be acceptable for his business or personal reputation. Paul intended to propose a settlement around $3 million, or suggest abandoning negotiations entirely. Paul also needed my authorization to take a more aggressive stance if the offer was rejected. He explained that he wouldn't hesitate to expose potentially damaging details about Jessica, our marriage, and even my personal life in court if necessary. He warned that the process could get ugly and highly publicized, but he was prepared to use every legal avenue to win the case. Some details might be unpleasant, but he was ready to reveal them if it came to that. I told Paul I had thought about this deeply and was willing to proceed if needed, although I preferred to explore the financial settlement first. Paul agreed and suggested we start by evaluating John's offer. He assured me that if the offer wasn't satisfactory, he would handle all necessary paperwork quickly. Additionally, he mentioned leveraging his contacts in the media to ensure coverage if needed, even if explicit content had to be censored. Acknowledging Paul's unwavering support, I expressed my frustration and wished the situation had never occurred. I authorized Paul to take whatever actions were necessary. I didn't initiate this mess, but I was determined to bring it to a close. Paul then shifted our focus to the upcoming meeting. He explained that Mr. Thomas Reed, the owner of the tennis club, was the man identified in the video. Paul expected Reed to take a hands-off approach, claiming that adults are responsible for their own actions. He also noted that even if Michael, the tennis coach, was dismissed for appearances, he might be rehired later due to his popularity, especially among female members. Paul reminded me that while men primarily paid club dues, women were significant stakeholders, which would be crucial in my discussion with Mr. Reed. We arrived just in time, and it was clear that Mr. Reed and Paul had a strained relationship. Their tension was palpable from the moment we entered. Paul introduced me and explained that my wife was a member of the club. He revealed that Michael Johnson, the tennis instructor, had been having an affair with my wife and inquired about Reed's plan to address the situation. Mr. Reed responded dismissively, stating that what consenting adults did in their personal time was none of his concern. He turned to me and bluntly suggested that if I couldn't satisfy my wife, it wasn't his problem. If you can to keep your wife satisfied, don't to come blaming me if she strays, Thomas Reed remarked with a contemptuous sneer. The tennis club welcomes a lot of disgruntled spouses, and some of them value the extra care my team offers. I felt a wave of rage when he winked at me, but Paul held tight to my wrist and told me to calm down and follow his example. Paul spoke to Thomas, pointing out that it was a large leap to assume that these things were happening outside the club without his knowledge or approval. Then he produced a DVD player, set it down on Thomas's desk, and turned on the device, aiming the screen at him. Thomas's face became white as the video aired. Before he could respond, Paul went on to say that Jessica Thompson, a paying member of the club whose dues were paid by me, had been taken advantage of by Thomas and his associates. Paul made it clear that I was a very unhappy client and forewarned me that if word got out, all husbands who paid dues would begin to wonder what their wives were getting up to at the club. Paul said that all of the men that were in the locker room that day should be subpoenaed because the married men would probably not be thrilled with Thomas. In addition, he brought up the concern of privacy invasion as a result of the video in the locker room, threatening to destroy the club's revenues and damage its brand. Paul outlined our expectations to stop this from happening, a significant financial offer and prompt action from Thomas, implying that doing so would save him a great deal of hassle and money. Thomas acknowledged the reasoning behind Paul's remarks as he weighed his options. He consented to return all cassettes and maintain their confidentiality in exchange for his compliance, and he promised to phone the following day with an offer. In addition, he threatened to dismiss Michael right away. Calling us legal bandits, he dismissed us and instructed us to go out. Grinning, Paul picked up the DVD player and powered it down. Paul asked Thomas to greet Robert Garcia on his behalf as we were leaving. Thomas curtly said, "Go to hell." As we made our way to the parking lot, Paul kept laughing and said that we would now have to wait for the bids to come in. By the week's end, John Davis had made an almost $5 million offer. Michael Smith was abruptly fired by John, leaving him without any other options after he foolishly gave him all of his videos. I went after Michael's two clients who had an affair with my wife. They both wanted to stay out of the spotlight and gave me $1 million each to stay silent. Thomas Reed dared us to sue instead of making any kind of offer. When we did, he lost $4 million in the end. By the time we were through, a large number of people had left his club, requiring him to give up ownership. Although he believed he could get away with it, the judge was not impressed by the adultery or the video of the locker room. Without giving Jessica a single cent in alimony, I gave her the house and automobile she had desired. Only twice did I see her in court, and both times she cried when I called her a strumpet. I used to wonder all the time why she sobbed back then instead of causing me so much trouble. I had more money than I could have ever imagined after taking Paul's advice, but the grief still haunts me to this day. I was abruptly jolted out of my reverie when the restaurant manager asked how things were going. I shook my head to clear my mind, not sure how long I had been standing there, and turned back to the here and now. The restaurant manager's curious glance jolted me back to reality. I apologized for being lost in thought and made my way directly to my ex-wife's table. The surprise on her face was clear the last time she saw me. I was overweight with long, unkempt hair and a beard, still struggling with an old knee injury from baseball. That had been my excuse, but in reality, I had become complacent in our life together. Now, with a short haircut, a fit physique from consistent workouts, and a repaired knee thanks to Michael and John S. settlements, I looked entirely different. My suits were now tailored and sophisticated, and I took great care in presenting myself well in public. Approaching her table, I noticed the change in her expression. The man sitting next to her, initially ready to defend her, was calmed by her gesture to stay seated as tears began to well up in her eyes, smudging her makeup. Her boyfriend advised her to fix her makeup, and she left for the restroom, tears streaming down her face. As she walked away, I noticed the large engagement ring on her finger. The man introduced himself as Jessica S. CFO and warned me to be cautious with my words to avoid causing a scene. I reassured him that I only had a few questions, and then I would be out of their lives forever. I didn't want anyone else to experience what I had gone through. I assumed Jessica had painted me as a horrible husband, abusive, neglectful, or unfaithful, but I wasn't there to change his opinion of me. I asked if Rachel still hosted her Avon gatherings on Wednesdays and Fridays. He corrected me, explaining that Jessica helped Rachel with her decor sales on Mondays and Thursdays. I inquired if she still played tennis on Tuesdays, to which he smugly replied that she played on Sundays, pointing out my poor memory for someone who was married to her for so long. Finally, I asked if he had ever looked under the bottom drawer of the dresser in their living room. He responded with confusion, wondering why he would do that. I explained that the 3 questions I asked were the reasons for our separation. I revealed that I still had all the leftover divorce paperwork, emails from Rachel and other women, and hours of videotapes. I had carried these with me for 3 years and thought he should have them. I pulled out a worn piece of paper from my wallet, explaining that it was what another woman had written to Jessica when she sought advice on how to get rid of me before I discovered her infidelity. After reading that letter, I realized I didn't know her at all, but it all revolved around him. I knew Jessica S. habits well. She always followed the same routine meticulously, sometimes driving me crazy. I suspected that even with a new man, she would stick to her old ways. Curiosity got the better of him, and he reached over to open the letter. I had carried it for 3 years, rereading it occasionally and striving to better myself so that no woman would ever write such things about me again. As I watched him read, I thought back to the day I discovered Jessica S. infidelity. It was a cold, gray morning, and I had come home early from a business trip, excited to surprise her. Instead, I found her in our bed with another man. The shock and betrayal I felt in that moment were overwhelming, and it took everything in me not to lash out. I quietly left the house, my mind racing with thoughts of revenge and heartbreak. I knew then that our marriage was over, but I never imagined the journey I would undertake in the years that followed. The divorce was messy and drawn out. Jessica fought for everything she could get, using every dirty trick in the book. But I was determined to come out of this stronger. I hired Paul, who was not only a brilliant lawyer but also a supportive friend. With his help, I navigated the legal minefield and managed to secure a favorable settlement. The financial compensation from Michael and John helped me rebuild my life. But the emotional scars remained. I threw myself into work and fitness, transforming my body and mind. The physical changes were obvious to everyone, but the internal transformation was even more significant. I learned to value myself and not let Jessica S. betrayal define me. I developed new hobbies, traveled, and made new friends. Slowly, I began to heal. Still, the pain of Jessica S. actions lingered. Every time I saw a happy couple, I felt a pang of jealousy and regret. I wondered what I had done wrong, why I hadn't been enough for her. But over time, I realized that her actions were a reflection of her own issues, not mine. I couldn't control her behavior, only my own response to it. Meeting her again now in this restaurant brought back a flood of memories. I could see the guilt and regret in her eyes, but it was too late for apologies. Our lives had moved in different directions, and I was no longer the man she once knew. I had grown and changed while she seemed to be stuck in the past. Her new boyfriend, the CFO, was clearly uncomfortable with my presence. He tried to maintain a calm facade, but I could see the tension in his posture and the worry in his eyes. He didn't want a scene, and neither did I. But there were things that needed to be said. I explained to him that the 3 questions I asked were not random, but pointed to the reasons why my marriage to Jessica had fallen apart. Her infidelity, Her deceit and her relentless pursuit of material gain had destroyed any trust and love I had for her. I showed him the letter, a tangible reminder of the betrayal that had shattered my world. As he read, I could see the realization dawning on him. He was beginning to understand the depth of Jessica S.'s betrayal and the impact it had on my life. I didn't want to hurt him, but he needed to know the truth. He needed to see Jessica for who she really was, not the facade she presented to the world. I didn't expect him to leave her or confront her immediately, but I hoped that this revelation would plant a seed of doubt in his mind. Perhaps he would think twice before committing to her fully, and maybe, just maybe, he would avoid the same pain I had endured. As Jessica returned from the restroom, her makeup hastily reapplied, she looked at me with a mixture of anger and sorrow. I could tell she wanted to say something, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. Her new boyfriend handed her the letter, and she glanced at it briefly before crumpling it in her hand. She tried to dismiss my presence as insignificant, but I knew better. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no escaping it. I didn't gloat or revel in her discomfort. I simply felt a sense of closure. For years, I had carried the weight of her betrayal, but now, standing here, I felt lighter. I turned to leave, knowing that this encounter had finally given me the peace I needed. As I walked away, I heard Jessica S.'s boyfriend asking her questions, his voice tinged with doubt. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. My past with Jessica was behind me, and I was ready to move forward. Outside the restaurant, the cold air hit my face, a stark contrast to the warmth inside. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of liberation. The journey had been long and painful, but I had emerged stronger. Jessica S.'s actions had taught me valuable lessons about trust, self-worth, and resilience. I was no longer defined by her betrayal, but by my own strength and determination to rise above it. I walked to my car, each step feeling lighter than the last. I knew that this chapter of my life was finally closed, and I was free to write a new one. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while I felt hopeful. I had faced my past, confronted my pain, and come out the other side. Now it was time to embrace the possibilities that lay ahead. All the evidence was overwhelming, but that letter was the most striking, which is why I've held on to it all this time. He read the letter with a deep sense of dismay, setting it aside with a mixture of shock and resolve. He then hastily scribbled a note, not looking up or acknowledging me, and left the restaurant abruptly. His demeanor remained stoic and unreadable. As he exited, I took a quick glance at the note he'd written. It read, "I'll be back shortly. Please stay here. I need to check the bottom drawer of the living room dresser. Liam." It was clear he had been deeply affected by the letter and was now intent on verifying the contents for himself. The letter seemed to have been the final straw, compelling him to take immediate action. I left a note on Emily S.'s table saying my goodbyes and deciding to leave the restaurant. I wasn't going to stay there any longer. I called my client to inform them that we needed to reschedule our meeting due to the delay. Before leaving, I took one last look back at the table. Emily returned, searching for Liam. She sat down and noticed the letter and the note he had left behind. Her expression changed dramatically as she read them, her face blanching with shock. The last sight of Emily was of her in a state of intense weeping, attracting the attention of everyone in the restaurant. I felt a fleeting sense of sympathy, but remained largely indifferent. That marked the end of our encounters. I often ponder if Liam discovered anything of significance under the dresser drawer. The depth of Emily S.'s distress suggested that he might have found what he was looking for.